Good morning, guys, and welcome to our May 5th video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War at home. All right, let's go ahead and get right on into it. The My Lai Massacre. Vietnamization dampened anti-war protests until November 12th of 1969, when journalist Seymour Hersh published an article describing a grisly killing spree at My Lai. My Lai was a village in South Vietnam. The My Lai Massacre occurred in March of 1968 and was then covered up by the U.S. military. Believing My Lai to be a Viet Cong stronghold, U.S. soldiers traveled to the village on a search and destroy mission. They found no armed Viet Cong in the village, only women, children, and old men. Still, one morning, the soldiers rounded up and executed about 500 of these civilians. Only a handful of the villagers survived. An incident like this was viewed as unacceptable among the American public. So the national mood sours on Vietnam. News of the massacre shocked Americans. Although many doubted such an atrocity could occur, others believed that the soldiers were merely following orders and that their actions were justified. Regardless, enough Americans expressed extreme amounts of outrage over the massacre that President Nixon decided to accelerate the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. Throughout the week, take a chance to look at a lot of the supplemental videos that I'm going to be posting for you. There's a lot of stuff on Vietnam protests, and you can get a great look at exactly how energized people were around the country during this time period. The 60s and 70s were hyperactive when it came to civic involvement in terms of protest. So a protest unlike any other. The news of the My Lai massacre added fuel to the rekindled anti-war movement. About a month before, on October 15, 1969, peace activists staged the biggest anti-war demonstration in U.S. history, known as the nationwide Vietnam Moratorium Day. Now, a moratorium is a suspension of activity. Organizers asked Americans to take the day off to reflect on the war. More than 2 million people, from young students to older, middle-class Americans, participated in this day of dramatic and widespread protests. 2 million Americans all over the country protesting the Vietnam War all together on the same day. A pretty incredible image, certainly. And on our next slide, you can get an even better sense of it. Whether it be right outside of the White House or marching to Capitol Hill, the protests were real and they were robust. Nixon responded to the outpouring of anti-war sentiment with a televised speech on November 3rd, reminding viewers of Vietnamization and his plan for withdrawing U.S. troops. He ended with an appeal to support the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, and he warned that the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Nixon's speech successfully quieted the anti-war movement for a time. It's not going to quiet it completely. As you will see as we move through the week. So the Kent State shootings, you're going to have a few videos on this incident. Really an amazing, sad moment in U.S. history. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 catalyzed another upsurge in protest. Students held mass rallies and demonstrations, some of which would even become violent. One of these incidents, the Kent State shootings, occurred when students at Kent State University in Ohio held a peace rally on May 4th, after several days of violent unrest, which included the burning of the Army Reserve Officers Training Corps building on campus. That is one way to get people's attention. However, the response is not what anyone would have hoped for. There was a call, obviously, to disperse the crowds. In response to the National Guard's actions, some students chanted slogans and threw rocks. The troops then opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9, all on a college campus. And on our next slide, you can get a pretty good indication in those pictures of exactly what happened. Just a horrible event in U.S. history. Okay. Next slide. Congress clamps down on the president. After Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, anti-war Congress members intensified their efforts. By the end of 1970, they repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which had allowed Johnson and Nixon to escalate conflict in Southeast Asia without formally declaring war. Again, remember, Congress is the only government body that can declare a war. Okay, so that's important. Congress is basically putting the reins back on the president. In February of 1971, Congress passed legislation forbidding U.S. troops from operating outside the borders of South Vietnam. And again, we had talked in our previous lesson about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That brings with it much in terms of difficult times for our troops. We know they are using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which goes through Cambodia, to get troops and supplies behind our lines. However, we are not allowed to attack them there. It puts our troops in a bad situation. 2 years later, when Congress learned that Nixon had secretly bombed Cambodia without congressional approval, lawmakers passed what was known as the War Powers Resolution. This law placed strict limits on the president's power to engage the U.S. armed forces in hostilities without the authorization of Congress. By this time, congressional support for the war had declined significantly, right? So you have public support waning, you have political support waning for the Vietnam War. It's time to get out of Vietnam. And that's going to be our topic for tomorrow. As always, stay well and stay healthy. I miss you guys very much. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.